The problem with helpful book marketing suggestions like get interviewed on podcasts is no one actually tells you how to create a pitch that will land you an interview. In this episode, I will share 3 tips and a 6-step formula that will help you craft a better pitch and hopefully get you a podcast interview. Obviously, I can't make any outlandish claims or promise you'll get interviewed on podcasts, but I can promise to show you how to present yourself to hosts so that they can see the value you can contribute to their show. Welcome to Amelia's Behind the Scenes Author Diary, an exclusive look at the behind the scenes misadventures of a 30-something mystery author. Discover how close she is to releasing her latest novel, hear exciting details about upcoming writing projects, and discover the lessons she has learned along her writing journey so you don't have to make the same mistakes. You can find the episode show notes and lots more information at authorpreneurpodcast.com/podcast. Hello writers. Recently I was on a book marketing webinar where the host recommended that authors do interviews on podcasts as a way to reach new readers. I'm not going to lie. As a podcast host, I audibly groaned at this suggestion, partly because it was pitched as an easy thing to do. The problem with helpful book marketing suggestions like this one is no one actually tells you how to create a pitch that will land you an interview. What usually happens is some authors will send a generic template email pitch to as many podcasts as they can find with the belief that casting your net wide will land you a few interviews. Technically that could work out, but I want you to be smarter and more strategic about getting interviews. Yes, I do agree that getting podcast interviews as an author could be a great form of marketing. And now for the fine print. If you follow these simple guidelines, it will help podcast hosts immediately see your value in among the sea of generic interview me submissions and say yes. The truth about getting podcast interviews as an author is all in the preparation work you do before contacting the host. To be frank, these are the steps I wish writers and authors took before requesting an interview on this podcast and my other podcast, which has rebranded as the Book Nerd Podcast. So what's wrong with the vague interview me on your podcast request? It's simple. The host has to find an angle and create a list of subtopics to cover for the interview. So what's wrong with that? All of these unknown elements about a potential interview mean hours of research on top of the 4+ hours of filming or recording and audio editing, depending on the type of podcast someone does. Some people will do an audio and a video version of their podcast, and they'll put the video version up on YouTube and the audio, which you're listening to right now. Hosting a podcast is a lot of work, so that vague request you just sent off added more work on top of the podcast host's plate. When you decide to launch a podcast, these are the things that you commit to. But as an author wanting to be interviewed by a podcast host, I think it's important to be mindful of how much of what you're actually asking a host to do when you send off a generic email that only took you 2 minutes to write. You're actually asking them to do a lot of work so you can sell your book to their audience. And no, providing all of your links is not enough. And even saying I write reverse harem romance, it's not an angle for an interview. When you pitch yourself to a podcast host, you want to present yourself as their dream podcast guest. How do I do that, you ask? In this quick guide on how to get interviewed on podcasts, I'm going to show you how to present yourself as that dream podcast guest. Over on my blog, I've created a companion guide on how to get interviewed on podcasts for authors. The blog post comprises of the podcast pitch, this 6-step formula, and a screenshot of a sample podcast pitch. In the screenshot, I show you how to incorporate all of the 6 steps into an email so that you can see it in action. If you're interested in checking out the quick guide, come on over to the blog post at authorpreneurpodcast.com/get-interviewed. If you're new to this podcast, I want to say a huge thank you for stopping by and trying out my show. To those of you who have been faithfully listening, thank you for listening in and supporting me. Your support means more to me than you know. Tip number 1. Consider what you want to achieve. Before you start researching podcasts to pitch, you need to get clear on what you want to achieve. Ask yourself the following questions. Do you want to find readers for your books? Or do you want to share your journey to publication or lessons learned with others? Do you want to make friends with other authors and build industry connections? You must get clear on the end result because this will affect the podcast you pitch as an author. If you're looking to find readers, pitching a podcast that focuses on sharing writing tips or self-publishing tips will not bring sales. Why? Because the audience is turning to the podcast for advice, not for their next read. As a result, the episode will not achieve many downloads. If you're after sales, you will need to find a podcast that's geared towards readers. Whereas if you want to build industry connections or share your journey, a podcast on self-publishing might be a good fit. The second tip is all about research. Now it's time to create a list of podcasts that have the right audience for you. After you've curated this list using your search engine of choice or the various podcasting apps available, you need to research the podcast, its host, and its audience. And I don't mean performing a quick internet search. Sure, start with search engines and reading the podcast about page, but dig a little deeper. To be frank, you need to get to know the host. You'd be surprised at the number of people, even though my podcasts are small, has a relatively small reach because they're quite niche and I'm not always consistent with my podcasting schedule, so that does affect my downloads. You'd be surprised as to how many people will actually want to be on my podcast, and 100% of those people, I can tell they don't listen to my show because of the way they talk to me, and it's also what they're expecting of me in the request. I can tell that they haven't considered, oh, this is what this audience listens to on this podcast and this is what I'm suggesting, and it doesn't match up. Like, I can tell they haven't considered the audience. I'm not expecting people to be huge fans of my podcasts, but I am at least expecting someone to listen to an episode just to get a feel for what the podcast is like. I've never done interviews on my podcast, but yet I still get interview requests. They don't even pose the question, do you do interviews? It's just assumed that I want to interview them. And because they've taken the time, 2 minutes to write an email, they will chase me for a response for their generic email. And it's such a mind-boggling experience because some of these authors, they could be a great interview for my audience, but I don't know because I can tell they haven't considered my audience and they haven't put any effort in, and that's a red flag for me because I sort of think, are they just going to show up on the day for the interview and not do any preparation work beforehand? Because I don't have a ton of experience interviewing people, and when someone isn't going to do the work before they show up to the interview, that actually makes my job harder, because the last thing you need as an author is to have a bad interview out there on the web. You don't need that. But rant over, back to the planned content. You need to figure out the host's name, the geographical information that's available, obviously not in a stalkery way, contact details, and find them on social media if they are on social media. The geographical location is important because you might be in different time zones and you may need to be flexible to secure an interview. For instance, if you live in Boston and you're pitching a podcast host who lives in London and you're only available after 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, you're asking the podcast host to interview you at midnight. I have a way around this because I have a booking calendar that immediately converts your location based on your IP address. So when you go on to book a podcast interview with me, if you get to the stage where I say yes, I'll send you a link to my calendar. And what happens is when you look at the calendar, you'll see my calendar and the times available in your time zone. So you don't have to worry about it, but not everyone will do this. And for those of you who are curious, the product I actually use to do that is Calendly. And to be honest, it wouldn't hurt to hit them up on social media and let them know you like their podcast. At this stage, don't ask for anything. All you want to do is no longer be a stranger. This simple comment will come in handy when you pitch the host via email or via a contact form or a form on their website if they have that. You want to no longer be a stranger. Because I have such a small following, I'm not like JD Robb, so I have such a small following. I would recognize someone, especially if they liked a few of my, say, Instagram Instagram images and then sort of commented underneath and said, I really like listening to your podcast, whichever one it is, and then sent me an email and requested an interview, I would remember you. Especially if you have your face as your profile pic on Instagram or Facebook and everything's consistent, like you're going by your pen name or your author name, and all the information is streamlined across all of your email and social medias, there's a good chance I'll remember you, and you're no longer a stranger. So you've broken down that a stranger asking for something, not that I know you, but I at least recognize you. But before you write that email, listen to a few episodes, get a feel for the podcast, figure out its target audience and whether the host conducts interviews. That last one is important because they may not have the technology to film or record in a way that's professional. So if you do want to be on a podcast and they don't do interviews, the first thing you should ask them is if they do interviews, because not everyone has access to all the bells and whistles other podcast hosts have. Some people might do a podcast on the cheap. They might be using Anchor, they've got a very basic microphone, and they've got no way of recording a second person. I do, but not everyone else has. I've got a bit of a technology, I'm not going to say addiction, but I like buying pieces of equipment for things. Like I've got a few microphones now because I've tried a few different things along the way, and I've worked out what is a great product for me and my podcast and what isn't. This microphone does pick up a lot of background noise, but I like the way my voice sounds in it for some reason. My voice sounds so much better in this than other things that I've used, which is why I put up with the background noise. So if you've looked at their podcast and you can't see that they've done any interviews, I would just send them a quick email and say, are you looking for authors to interview on your podcast? Maybe you should begin your pitch with that actually. Don't send two separate emails. I would pitch them and sort of see what happens. My third tip is explain your value. This is where the generic, please interview me on your podcast email that takes 2 minutes to write lets you down. After all of that research, you need to set yourself apart from the other authors vying for the host's attention. You need to highlight the value you can contribute to the podcast and its audience. What will be the focus of the interview? You need to niche down. For instance, you might want to share how you outline science fiction romance novels. Or maybe you want to discuss what inspired you to write your latest mystery novel. Dig a little deeper than that. Consider the points you wish to discuss in the interview. So why should you do this? It shows you've thought about the interview beyond the end result, especially if you're wanting to sell something to their audience. Hardly anyone does this, and it will set you apart from all of the other interview requests. Create a list of 3 things you want to discuss, and up to 5 if the episodes are an hour long. For a podcast interview that's under 30 minutes, I would definitely create a list of 3 things, and for an hour-long interview podcast, I would choose 5 things. The final step in tip 3 is to explain how this interview will benefit the podcast audience, or in layman's terms, why the podcast audience will enjoy listening to this episode. This may be obvious to you, but it's important to spell it out because it just makes the answer easier for the podcast host, because you've shown them that you're willing to put in the effort to do your fair share of work to make the interview great. You've thought of the audience, and all of this work just makes it easier for the host to say yes, which is what you want. If you've heard something in this episode that was helpful to you and you'd like to support the show, then buy me a coffee for as little as £1 at buymeacoffee.com/author ADH. Tip number 4 is pull it all together. And now you're ready to write your email pitch to the podcast host. Here is my 6-step formula that will help you craft a better pitch. And this is what I promised you at the beginning of the podcast. I just needed to explain all of these steps in order for this formula to actually make sense for you. Step 1 is to introduce yourself but keep it brief. Step 2 is talk about what you like about the podcast. Step 3, in a short sentence, highlight what you want to discuss on the show. Step number 4 is provide a list of discussion points that you want to bring up in the interview. So this is those 3 or 5 topics you want to discuss from the previous tip. Step number 5 is explain why the audience will enjoy listening to the episode. And the final step number 6, is after this, provide a short bio, social media links, and links to your books and other places on the web. For goodness sake, do not let a podcast host search for your books, because I've had someone do this. It took me forever to find their books. And then I realized their book wasn't suited to the podcast, so it just became super weird. And I had to reply back to them. I think they started stalking me and asking me on social media, and it just became super awkward. So whatever you do, make sure you make your book easy for the host to find, because just because you know where it is doesn't mean the host will be able to find it. In essence, you want to make the interview request appear to be a no-brainer. A great podcast host will prepare and research on top of this information you provide, but you've just made that job a lot easier. For the sake of clarity and to give you a few ideas about pitching yourself as a fiction author, I've included a screenshot where I'm pitching myself for an interview on my second podcast, which has now been rebranded and relaunched as the Book Nerd Podcast. Just a quick reminder, over on my blog, I've created a companion guide blog post which comprises of the podcast pitch 6-step formula that I've just explained to you, and a screenshot of this pitch. In the screenshot, I show you how to incorporate all these 6 steps into an email so you can see it all in action. If you're interested in checking out the quick guide, come on over to the blog post at authorpreneurpodcast.com/get-interviewed. Actually, I think I will read out the email that I constructed in the podcast right now. So here is the sample email podcast pitch that I've created for you, where I will show you this 6-step formula in action. So in the subject line, I've just put podcast interview on, and this is where you would insert the name of the podcast, and I've put colon and then the topic that I wanted to discuss on the podcast. And my topic is the museums, chateaus, mythology, and the events that inspired me to write my mystery novella, Missing. Hello, and then obviously podcast host name. My name is Amelia. I write under the pen name A.D. Hay, and I'm the author of Missing, the first book in a mystery series featuring investigative reporter James Lalonde. I've been following the Book Nerd podcast since the first episode in January. I particularly enjoyed the episode where you shared 13 mystery and thriller novels featuring characters who were journalists. I found quite a few good reads from that list. I was wondering if you might be interested in having me on your show to talk about the museums, chateaus, and mythology and events that inspired me to write my mystery novella, Missing. Here are a few topics we could discuss. I actually put 6 topics in here because I think that's just what I could come up with when I brainstormed. Number 1 is how the Arthurian legend inspired me to write my mystery novella, Missing. The real-life locations, museums, and chateaus featured in Missing. My love of amateur sleuths and private investigators as main characters, for instance, Agatha Raisin, Miss Marple. My favourite mystery and thriller novels that inspired me to write. Absolute Proof, The Cutthroat, Bodleian Library, The Rivers of London series, and Dan Brown novels. What I'm currently reading, movies that inspired me to write and keep writing. Self-Listed Zodiac, Murder on the Orient Express, Spotlight, Knives Out, The Murder at the Vicarage. I believe your audience will enjoy hearing about the books I've read, current reads, and real-life locations that inspired my mystery novella, Missing. And I hope you'll be interested in having me as a guest on your show. In the event that you are, here are a few things that will make your job easier. And I've just listed a very short bio along with where to find me on the web with a link to my book. So that's basically the email pitch that I've created. I did create a list of 6 things. You don't necessarily have to have that many, but it was just more for it's weird because I've pitched myself, but I needed to show a real life example. So I wanted the podcast host to see that there are a lot of things we could discuss, and it's sort of, they could essentially really choose a few things from that list and just focus on that. But I guess my main point is I wanted to prove that I was prepared prepared to do the work, that I would be a good interview guest. And that's really what you want to do when you pitch someone. So this notion of sending a generic email out to as many podcasts as you can get your hands on, it's not a good idea, because you haven't proven, especially if you've never been interviewed before. And that's not something a podcast host would turn you away from. I wouldn't turn someone away from a podcast interview purely based on the fact that they've not had any interviews. What's actually more important for me is I want to know if they will do the work to prepare for that interview. I had my first interview on this Self-Publishing Journeys podcast before I pressed publish on Missing, and I did an insane amount of preparation for that interview, and I listened back to it and I still die on the inside because I find it really embarrassing. And that's no reflection on the podcast host, because Paul Teague is a former BBC radio journalist, so he's a great interviewer. It was more of the fact that I was so early on in my career, I hadn't published, and I don't know, I just hate listening to myself back. So obviously editing this podcast is a nightmare because I have to listen to my voice. I didn't actually pitch him for that email either. He sort of found me and asked me, and I thought, okay, I'll do that. And then after I said yes, I kind of freaked out, did a whole bunch of preparation and research, because I was like, I want to add value to his audience, because I was about to launch my own podcast. And I had a YouTube channel where I was sharing writing tips as well. And I just wanted to make sure that whatever I did, even though I couldn't sell a book, I still added value to the audience. I didn't want to waste anyone's time, and I didn't want to build a reputation of being a time waster. I at least wanted to be known for adding value. And I was aware of the benefits that come with nurturing relationships as you go on in your writing journey. I think that's really important. Not that I'm expecting anything from him or anything like that. I'm not expecting anything from the relationship, but it's more of the fact that you never know what's going to happen, and I don't like burning bridges. You get my point. I wanted to be a great podcast guest because I didn't want a bad interview out there. I do listen to it and cringe a little bit, but that's more to do with me listening to myself back and being extremely judgmental of myself. Anyway, I'm rambling. So that was my 6-step formula, as well as how to actually write that email pitch. You can see a screenshot of that email pitch. If you want me to, I can create either an Evernote template or a Word document where I can help you frame the email pitch, where I'll set it up like I did there, but instead of my entries, I will put like in brackets and bold or a different color, put this information here. So you've got the framework, you can just sort of put in the pieces and then tweak it so you've got something that resembles a decent podcast pitch, just to make it easier, because it took me a long time to figure out how I wanted to write that email. Maybe not a long time, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but it took me a good 90 minutes to figure out that's how I wanted the email to look and read. I did actually make a few minor typos, like when I put this through Grammarly and Pro Writing Aid, and I forgot to delete a couple of words, so there's a few mistakes. So maybe I will create a Word document template, Evernote template. So if you are interested in getting that Word document or Evernote template, then come on over to the blog post at authorpreneurpodcast.com/get-interviewed, and in the comments section, let me know if you want a Word document with that email pitch, or you can come on over to the Facebook group, which has been cleverly or creatively named the Authorpreneur Podcast Community. Yeah, the Authorpreneur Podcast Community, and let me know underneath the episode. I will share this episode in this group, and underneath that, if you want me to create the template, let me know. Say, hey, I would like the Word document template, and I'll just add it to I think in the Facebook group there's a way for me to add media documents that you can download, because I've seen that in other groups. I know 20 Books to 50K do that, and I think the self-publishing show, which was the self-publishing formula, do that as well. So I'd definitely be able to do that. So to find that group, it's actually facebook.com/groups/indie author pod, all one word. I'll leave a link to that in the show notes in your favorite podcasting app, and over on the blog post, which I've said like 3 or 4 times now. with the Authorpreneur podcast community, I do want to create something that's like a very cheap version of writing coaching. I have sort of created a weekly rundown where I want to encourage people to sort of set goals for the week. I want to do a few live write-in streams, write-in, edit with me, live streams in the group. I am considering doing a after show, but that might be a lot of work, and a monthly live group coaching session. And also we'll have a day where we talk about our weekly wins, where you talk about whether you've hit your goals or if you just have something that happened that week that you want to celebrate and share with the group. There'll be like a day where we do that, but you can do that every day. But it was just more for me to have some sense of organization. That's what the Authorpreneur community is. I've had this up for a while now, but I've been meaning to tell people about it and ask people to join if that's what they want. I hope you found this quick guide on how to get interviewed on podcasts helpful and informative. Good luck with navigating the podcast world, and I wish you all the best in securing your first or next interview. Thank you for listening, and happy reading and writing, everybody. Thank you for listening to Amelia's Behind the Scenes Author Diary. You can find the episode show notes, back catalogue episodes, and lots more information at authorpreneurpodcast.com/podcast. I'm your host, Amelia, and I'll see you in the next Behind the Scenes Author Diary episode.